annual Edward N. Brandt Jr. Memorial Lecture in Women's Health. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here, students, staff, friends, and community members for this very special annual occasion. And I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome to members of Ed Brandt's longtime faculty home, the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, College of Public Health, and to Ed Brandt's family members who are watching online. As many of you know, the Edward N. Brandt Jr. Memorial Lecture in Women's Health is an annual lectureship jointly sponsored by the Milken Institute School of Public Health and the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, College of Public Health. The lectureship was created to honor Dr. Brandt, a former Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, also known for his many contributions to health care, and in particular, the support of women in the sciences and research in women's health. Our partnership with the University of Oklahoma on this series has allowed us to shine the spotlight on women's health and to foster critical dialogue in areas of health policy, research, and advocacy. I'm particularly proud of the work of the Jacobs Institute of Women's Health here at our university. Susan Wood, as well as Liz Borkowski, do a tremendous job in creating awareness and impact through their work advancing research policy and practice at the regional, national, and local levels. Over the past year, workplace sexual harassment and assault have received some long overdue public attention. And I should say, here at our university, as well as at universities across the country, this has also been a very significant issue in terms of the need to come forward to address the treatment of women, minorities, and others across campuses and respond appropriately when there is mistreatment. This public health problem disproportionately harms women, and particularly women of color. Addressing it effectively will require policy changes, legal action, and very fundamental cultural changes. I'm thrilled that our 2018 Brandt Lecture features Fatima Das-Graves, who is one of the leaders in the movement to ensure that everyone can work in environments free from harassment and assault. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dean Gary Raskob of the College of Public Health at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Gary is not only our collaborator in putting this forward, but Gary is also a leader among all the deans of public health across the country. He's somebody who is a great pleasure for me to work with in the context of our association and other ways that we're able to work together. So it's especially a thrill for me to host him here today. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
I'll speak loud so you can hear.
Actually, you can speak into the mic so that you
this one?
pick it up.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. Well, thank you, Lynn, for those kind remarks. I want to thank you, Susan, the Jacobs Institute, the Milken Institute School of Public Health here, and express on behalf of the University of Oklahoma and the College of Public Health our sincerest appreciation and honor to continue this collaboration as we honor our friend and colleague, Dr. Ed Brandt. It's my privilege just to make a few short comments about Dr. Brandt that frames, I think, the topics and the lectureship that we use to honor his legacy. Dr. Brandt was born in Oklahoma City. He obtained his MD degree and his PhD in biostatistics from the University of Oklahoma, and he was a diehard Oklahoma Sooner all his life, including the red OU slippers that he wore at the house and just many other things, and I know you'll be very excited as we face Alabama on December 29. Dr. Brandt had a long, distinguished career in both academic public health and in governmental public health service, and I'm going to highlight just a couple things, of course, but you know, before I do that, I just want to say this past week we saw by Ed Brandt. He embodied all of the qualities of a gentleman, of a compassionate physician, of social justice and public health service, decency, integrity, and a commitment to always do the right thing. And I think as we look at our environment right now, and in a school here, of course, with such a great tradition of public health policy research, I think it's really instructive to just hear two brief quotes about Dr. Ed Brandt. One from U.S. Representative Henry Waxman, who said, "He was at all times a gentleman as well as a creative and public-spirited leader. His deep principles and unflagging ethics transcended politics. Most importantly, he retained his focus as a compassionate physician with deep concern about the health and well-being of the people of the nation." And the second quote from U.S. Senator Orrin Hatch said, "His leadership, knowledge, and ability to work with colleagues from across the political spectrum helped steer the nation through difficult times and into a new age of health policy." And whoa, we could have someone receiving such laudatory comments from individuals at such opposite ends of the political spectrum who collaborated together. Everybody who worked and knew Ed Brandt had the utmost respect for his leadership, and it's really just an honor and a privilege to be here today for this lecture and to tell you these comments about him. And I'm really looking forward to the comments of our speaker, because I know from your background and your commitment and service that Ed would be very, very proud to have you as a speaker for this lecture today. So thank you very much. And I'm really honored, and we truly, truly appreciate this ongoing collaboration. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Wood, Director of the Jacobs Institute of Women's Health here at the Milken Institute School of Public Health, and I get the privilege of introducing the Ed Brandt Lecturer in Women's Health this year. And we're really thrilled to be able to have Fatima Goss-Graves to talk to us today. She is the President and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, and she has spent her entire career fighting to advance opportunities for women. One of the a recent and notable thing is that she is the co-founder of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, and she both started the original network, but then has taken it to the next level in these times. She has been at the Law Center for a number of years, working in areas of employment, education, health and reproductive rights. She also led the Center's anti-discrimination initiatives in education and employment. So she has a broad spectrum of interest and advocacy, and looking keenly at the legal issues as well, facing women in all of the challenges across our lives. She received her JD from Yale Law School in 2001, and she is widely quoted in the media and seen as a leading expert and advocate in the areas of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and the legal rights of women. So thank you very much. You might join us.
Well, what an honor to be here for this lecture. Thank you, Susan, for the invitation, and to GW and the Milken School and the Jacobs Institute. And what an honor to hear your introduction of Ed Brandt. And is it not loud enough? Okay. I hope that I will do his legacy justice here in this conversation. And I also just really wanted to thank you for situating the issue of harassment and violence in the space of public health. We've been having this conversation from a space of accountability. We've been having this conversation from a space of institutional change and policy change. Very little of that conversation has been around public health and the health consequences for survivors and health consequences for even having this conversation. So truly, truly thank you for raising the visibility and the connection, which is something that we have been trying to do at the National Women's Law Center as well. So I have been at the National Women's Law Center for over a decade, but I've been president for a little over a year. And I was about 4 months into my tenure as president and CEO when Me Too went viral. And this country began to, and really the world, began to grapple with what it would look like and mean to take Toronto Burke's vision and turn it into a new idea of what it means to live and work and be with safety and dignity and equity. Because that's really the conversation I think we've been having in this last year. And it has been exciting and inspiring and difficult, and I just want to acknowledge I have a lot of staff from the National Women's Law Center here as well who have been deep into this work and talking every day to survivors, and I'm just really grateful about what we have been able to build in this time. So I want to begin with a little bit of a conversation about those specific health consequences and get a little deeper. You know, we know that sexual harassment and assault has devastating consequences for people. There has been study after study that has shown that around their mental and their physical health, around their cardiovascular health, around immune functioning, around inflammation, around stress hormone cortisol, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, weight gain, weight loss. So you could really say that harassment and violence is making us sick. And the victims of sexual harassment have reported a range of physical manifestations. If you look just at the case law, you'll see cases where people are describing that their hair is falling out, that they've gained weight, that they have highs, that they're having panic attacks, that they're not sleeping or sleeping too much, among many other things. Also, there is the mental strain, which too often goes unrecognized, that may last over time, around memory function, eating disorders, low self-esteem, anxiety, depression. And sometimes those are in the moment, and sometimes those are long-lasting. And one of the things that I will forever be really grateful for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford for is almost the public teaching that she gave this country, that the experiences of violence and harassment can stay with you decades and decades later. And so no matter the outcome, I am grateful to her for sharing that experience, but also providing her expertise while doing so. We hear from our clients in schools who talk about how they're unable to learn, students who are performing really well, who suddenly are struggling to go to school at all or drop out altogether. We hear from workers every day who are losing opportunities at work, who feel like they're forced to quit, that they're forced to choose between having an income and working with safety. We hear from patients who are foregoing medical care that they actually need because they do not feel safe in medical settings. So in this period that we have had, where there is this rich cultural conversation, it seems like we need more of grounding that conversation in the very serious and urgent public health consequences. I'm going to take a step back, though, and talk a little bit about how we came to launch the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. And in some ways, it grew out of a deep desire to build something together in an era and period where we were playing a lot of defensive work. And I won't lie, the last 2 years, on almost every front that we work on at the National Women's Law Center, health and reproductive rights, workplace and education, around our economic security work more broadly, we're playing a lot of defensive work. And that is not what we wanted to be only doing as an organization, and it is also not what we thought our movement needed to build for the future. So So around 2 years ago, we started having conversations about what would it look like to build and plan and tap into the many, many attorneys that were reaching out to us at the time, this is late 2016 and early 2017, saying, I want to help. And we began to build this idea about what would it take to pair these attorneys with the many phone calls that you get for people who say, I need help. So it took us many months to craft, but we crafted what we call the Legal Network for Gender Equity. The goal of that network is to connect people who've experienced sex discrimination across settings in healthcare and education and employment, connect them with attorneys so that they can understand their rights and have really a force behind them willing to take up their cause and fight for change. We had planned to actually, if I'm confessing, and I was telling Susan outside, we'd actually planned to launch this the summer of 2017. But for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with Harvey Weinstein, we ended up launching it the week that the Weinstein story broke in the New York Times. So just a few days before, we launched this network dedicated to sex discrimination where we had built 200 attorneys who were ready to go. And we said, we wonder if these people are going to respond. And they did. And all of a sudden, we felt overwhelmed. I will tell you, we were getting 20 to 30 calls a week, and we were like, what is this? Mostly on harassment. And that was a giant uptick for an organization like ours. That continued to persist in October and November. And in late November, I got a call from Tina Chen, who is the former chief of staff of First Lady Michelle Obama, who she calls forever First Lady. I kind of do too. But she called and she said, you know, after Me Too went viral, women in Hollywood have been getting together and meeting in really serious ways, and we have an idea. And it turns out women around this country and really around this world were gathering. What started in digital spaces started happening and showing up in person around kitchen tables with people sharing their experiences, with people trying to say, what do we do about this moment? That's part of what kept that cultural movement going. And in Hollywood, they had started to have a conversation about how can we transform our organizations that we work in? How can we show up at work and really feel safe? How is it that we can be in a situation where we are working day in and day out and are having the same experiences, but no one is stopping it? And then they received this beautiful letter from my dear friend, Monica Ramirez, who is a co-founder of an organization called Alianza de Campesinas and runs an organization called Justice for Migrant Women. And they sent a letter that started, Dear Sisters. And basically that letter didn't say, look, you think you have it bad? Just look at us working in the fields. That's bad. Instead, they say, we see you, we believe you, and we're gonna come march with you in the streets on your behalf, because that's what we do, we march. And part of the letter said, we wish that we could say that we're shocked to learn that this is such a pervasive problem in your industry. Sadly, we're not surprised because it's a reality we know far too well. Countless farm worker women across our country suffer in silence because of the widespread sexual harassment and assault they face at work. Please know that you're not alone, we believe you, and stand with you. So they published this letter, and from then on, what became Time's Up, it had no name at that time, people were just sort of scrambling, knew that it could be about transforming what was happening in Hollywood and in the entertainment industry more broadly. But it had to be about really transforming the way it is that women are able to work. And can we upset the whole idea that you can't work with safety and dignity and equity? So we built this thing in basically less than 2 months, where we are now at the National Women's Law Center, housing and administering what has become the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. We launched it on January 1st. As I've told people, our schedule was really critical because we were going into award season. And I am now a total convert to the power of award season. During the Golden Globes, which I would watch from home, you know, or at least I'd watch the red carpet, they turned it into the most magnificent red carpet mobilization that I have seen, where they all decided they were wearing black. And as reporters tried to ask what you were wearing, the activists who were there with the actresses and actors turned their questions on their head and said, we're here to talk to you about what it would look like for restaurant workers to work with safety. And they took over the red carpet. And in that 2-hour period of the Golden Globes, we heard from over 200 people at the National Women's Law Center. So it showed me quite powerfully what it actually can look like to reach a wide range of people. And the people who called in, they told us, I'm calling in because I saw this person telling their story. And if they could do that with all of that risk, I feel like I can come forward too. It was totally inspiring. So we launched that on January 1st, and in less than a year, we have received over 4,300 requests for legal assistance. The vast majority of those, about 3,800, involve workplace sexual harassment and retaliation, which is what the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is devoted to. 2/3 of the people who have reached out to us identify as low income. 1/3 identify as people of color, and about 9% identify as LGBTQ. We've heard from workers in every state. We've heard from workers in over 60 different sectors of our economy. And we are continuing to match people who are seeking legal assistance with attorneys, now over 800, who have said, I want to be a Time's Up attorney. It is my duty and my right to help. We also are funding cases. The cases that we have funded since March have ranged across sectors as well, but we are funding currently 80 cases, and we've committed over $5 million. But we're not done, we're just beginning. And the reason we know we are just beginning is when we launched Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, we knew that there was an opportunity to really dive in and provide services immediately to the people who were seizing this moment and saying Me Too and showing up and trying to confront the systems that they were in, that they were going to need a few things like lawyers, some cases PR specialists, some cases even more, and we have built this thing that I am so extremely, extremely proud of, to have built a proactive thing in this time when we were playing a lot of defensive work. But I want to talk a little bit about, there's been a lot of attention to what's been happening in the workplace, and part of that is that's where a lot of the cultural conversations have been. But I want to talk a little bit about what we have seen in our intake line and in the work around the way harassment and violence is also showing up in education spaces and in health settings. So our legal network, one of the beautiful things about it is you can be a Time's Up attorney, but you can also agree to take cases across settings, which many of our attorneys have. And it is also currently connecting people who are facing harassment and violence in schools. To just ground us a little bit in a little bit of data, we know that more than 1 in 5 women and nearly 1 in 18 men and more than 1 in 4 transgender and gender nonconforming students experience sexual assault while in college. And more than 1 in 5 girls between the ages of 14 and 18 have reported that they have been kissed or touched without their consent. So I think it's important, the conversation about harassment and violence in schools has been very situated at the college level, and in part, a lot of the activism has come from students in college. The students who we largely represent at the Law Center are younger. They're students in middle school and in high school who are experiencing the same violence, and when they go to talk to their schools about it, the experience that they have are terrible, right? It's not just that they're not believed, many of them have been punished in other ways for daring to name their experience. We also know that, despite the narrative, that men and boys are far more likely to be victims of sexual assault than to be falsely accused of it. But there's this narrative out there that it is an issue that only women should be concerned about. In fact, many male victims feel this extra burden that it's not just that they can't report, they know they won't be believed, and that they are doing something that is not just brave in reporting, but that goes against the grain that we have culturally, unfortunately, embraced. We also know that more than half of LGBTQ students who are in age ranges 13 to 21, so spanning both secondary schools and post-secondary schools, say that they are sexually harassed at school. And we know that students with disabilities are 2.9 times more likely than their peers to be sexually assaulted, but have largely been invisible in conversations around harassment and violence. So despite the frequency and despite what I think is really powerful activism, very few people actually report harassment and violence still while they're students. Only 12% of college survivors and only 2% of girls ages 14 to 18 actually say that they would report the assault to either their schools or to the police. And some students don't report because there's real risks that come with reporting. I'll tell you just about one of our clients in a case that was resolved well in Alabama. But when she reported the violence that she endured, the very first conversation that she had with the school officials was about whether she would be in trouble. They said, well, we think that there is enough, and so you likely won't be in trouble for this. If you want to know whether that's a trauma-informed response that schools should be implementing, the answer is no. But that is what she encountered. And then the very untrained school officials went on to do terrible things, including constructing this idea that they would have her out there as bait and like maybe he'd do something again. You know, really, it is a matter that is urgent for our students, and one in which school officials and those adults that are working in school buildings need a lot of support around to make sure, as the people who will encounter this first often, that they get it right. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of having the opposite conversation. Because right now, even though there's this law, Title IX, that was passed over 45 years ago that bans sex discrimination in schools, including sexual harassment, the Secretary of Education has launched a new effort that is really driven by stereotypes about the way that sexual violence shows up in education spaces. So at this time where we're having this really important cultural conversation about shifting the way we treat harassment and violence through Me Too, at a time where, at least at the Law Center in our intake line, the story after story that we receive around harassment and violence shows that what schools need is a lot of training and support and understanding around how to get this right. We have our Secretary of Education and our Department of Education putting out total myths about sexual violence, suggesting that most people who make it up are liars, coming up with a whole new set of rules that will make it more likely that people won't come forward, that will increase the risk of you reporting at all. And that will also mean if you are assaulted off campus and then sit next to your assaulter in class the next day, the school will say there's nothing I can do about that. It's a shame. But we have not given up. In fact, we are in the middle of a comment period, and I would not be doing my job if I did not instruct all of you, if you are concerned about this, to go to our website at nwlc.org to find out more and to submit your own handwritten comment that really explains what you are concerned about with these rules. We have a ton of resources on our website. I highly encourage you. We have a team in the back that I'm sure can direct you the right direction. But in the middle of an opportunity to dramatically change how we deal with these issues across institutions, to have this coming from the Department of Education is actually really devastating. I also want to talk a little bit about healthcare, because even as there's been some attention to what happens in the education space, some attention to what happens in the workplace, there's actually been very little attention to the way that people experience violence and harassment in healthcare settings. And there's been almost no attention to the fact that we now have a giant tool that can be used to transform the way that people think about this. And one of the key tools that we have right now is the relatively new healthcare rights law. A part of the Affordable Care Act, for the first time, there is a ban against sex discrimination, which includes sexual harassment and violence in healthcare programs and activities that receive federal funds or that are federal conducted, which is a lot of healthcare settings. So there is, I think, an information gap. That law has only been in place since the Affordable Care Act passed in 2010. But it is something, especially in this moment, that people really need to know. Because the protections that it has now are huge. And the fact that there weren't those protections before mean things like, you know, insurance companies would charge women more than men for the same coverage, and everyone just accepted that insurance companies would treat conditions that were specific to women, like having a cesarean delivery as a reason to deny coverage, that employers would refuse to cover gender-specific things like birth control and maternity care. So the Affordable Care Act itself changed many of those practices, and they are no longer allowed, but the healthcare rights law goes further. What it means is that you can't discriminate, and you also can't sex stereotype. And so if hospitals or clinics or providers were engaging in sex stereotyping as a part of their practice and calling it care, they no longer can do that, right? There is this law that says you can't. And so you can't, to use a terrible example, refuse to provide sterilization care to a woman because they are married, because you have views about what it is that married people should and shouldn't do, right? That would be sex stereotyping applied in a way that would violate the healthcare rights law, which people have individual rights under. You can't, for example, prohibit providers or other healthcare workers. They cannot sexually harass their patients, even if they always did. They no longer can and be in compliance with the law. It is also a law that protects people from receiving lower quality care or delayed care or abusive care because of their sex. So it is also really important, a law that for LGBTQ individuals has been transformative. Because, again, the first-time ban on sex discrimination, which includes sex stereotyping, which includes discrimination based on gender identity, what you have seen show up in health settings is people making totally ridiculous decisions that they won't serve and protect people, or that maybe they can harass someone because they're transgender. You can't do that under 1557, the healthcare rights law. So there has been this giant tool that in the era of Me Too, again, a time where we are reevaluating what it really means to be equal in this country, that can be used for important change. You also, the healthcare rights law protections prohibit people from, say, denying someone care simply because they've had an abortion. The long-time practices that some people engaged in that we knew were sex discrimination, but were just totally unprotected, now have protection. So we have been using this groundbreaking law to challenge discriminatory practices, even if they are things that were long-time ideas. So we used it to challenge employers who had decided that they would exclude pregnancy coverage from dependent children. That became even more important as the Affordable Care Act fortunately allowed people to stay on plans longer until your children could stay until you're 26, except we're going to just have this one discriminatory piece as part of it. No, that makes no sense. We challenged that and were able to get successful results. We've also filed a complaint to stop long-term care insurance companies from charging women more than they charge men. So some of these are practices that are long time and long-standing and were considered just okay because nobody was challenging them, and we lacked that core law to actually challenge them. We've also been able to think about and use this law to challenge the harassment that people are experiencing when they go to medical providers. One client that we had went to a medical provider that was a chiropractor. And the things that she experienced when she showed up in that space to get care are totally absurd. She was propositioned. She was asked about her sex. She was asked about her own sexual encounters. She was asked to go out afterwards. She's trying to get her medical care. And what we know is that it is that sort of conduct that makes people delay care. It's that sort of conduct that makes people say, I'm not sure if I need that care. It's that sort of conduct that makes people mistrust providers, not just the one they're seeing in that moment, but mistrust providers more broadly. So in this period, we know in health settings, we can also do better. I have to give the caveat that unfortunately, the Trump administration doesn't fully agree with us. So they have failed to adequately defend the healthcare rights law, and they have signaled again and again in media and otherwise that they intend to try to undo the regulations that provide details about what this sex discrimination provision means. So that is another fight that we will be taking on in this period of building. I will end by saying one thing about where I think we are, and that is that, you know, in my time doing this work, I never dreamed that for this level of a sustained period, we would be having such a rich conversation around harassment and violence across settings. I never dreamed that we would be in a situation where people were in real time trying to rewrite culturally the rules that have grounded us for so long. And that is what we are experiencing. It is completely unsettling. It is uncomfortable. It makes institutions uncomfortable. And that institutions that are diving in and doing the work anyway, adopting the sorts of changes that will mean that actually at some point people will be able to be inside of their institution with safety and dignity, those will be the ones that will thrive. Those will be the ones that can exist going forward. There will be some that dig in their heels and that insist they aren't going to change, and that say what some reporters have been saying to me for the last years, that Me Too's about to go away any moment now. They're wrong. And that is why we've seen at the Times Up Legal Defense Fund and the work that we are doing in every space that we will have an opportunity to build and build and build going forward. So thank you for having me today. Thank you for grounding this conversation in public health, and I look forward to more conversation with all of you.
So we now are going to take this to a conversation. So we have two respondents with expertise in these topics from the public health perspective. So I'd like to ask Professor Mary Ellsberg and Emily Cohen, a doctoral student in prevention and community health. Sorry? What? The plaque. And meanwhile, while they're coming up, we're going to present Fatima Gosgrave with the, and I'm going to invite our deans to come up to help present Fatima with the plaque for the Brandt Lecture 2018. Thank you so much. Have a seat there, and if our two discussants can join us, what we'd like to do, have a seat at the pick up the chair. What we'd like to do is have to just speak briefly with their thoughts about this wonderful lecture that we just heard and learned so much from. Get some of their thoughts around the public health aspects of this, or just whatever they want to tell us about. And then we'll start a conversation between the three of them, and after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So will there be a chance for Q&A from the audience as well? I want to start with Mary.
Okay,
Mary, I'm turning it on. There we go.
Okay, thank you. I got lots of ideas, and I'll try and pare them down. I asked Susan what I should say, and she said, "Well, just listen to Fatima, and lots of ideas will come up," and they have. So, first of all, I'm thinking about what is it that public health researchers and practitioners can offer to this movement, and in a partnership with those activists and legal experts who have really started the movement here. And I think my experience would come from two areas. One is that I've been working in domestic violence primarily, but violence against women globally, and then thinking about it from the public health side. So I was thinking of, the first thought that I think is really important is that for some reason we keep dividing types of violence. Like, we can't think of women as a whole who experience multiple forms of violence. Some of them have very specific types of impacts, and others of them, it just compounds. And so women who are experiencing violence in the workplace may also have been experiencing it in schools. They've also, as you pointed out, experienced it in health centers, but they're also experiencing it at home, either as children with child sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. So it's like we can start with one thing. We started with rape. Well, rape's really bad, and we need to do something about it. And then we add, well, domestic violence also. And then it just seems like it's really difficult for people to understand that this is a much broader phenomenon. So that was one part of it. And I was thinking about a few areas where I feel like public health can be useful. One is evidence building, that we're really good at that. And in the field of intimate partner violence, and especially internationally, we found that doing studies on the prevalence of violence, for example, understanding in each country how much there is, what are the drivers, who are most affected? Is it mostly Hollywood actors, or is it mostly women of color, women, undocumented women, what are the industries, et cetera? So what is the kind of evidence that we need so that we can really advocate for better laws and better protections? That's one piece where I feel like and of course the health effects. The next piece that you've already talked about is we contribute to health policy and to compassionate, trauma-informed care, and this is something that we can also be talking about a lot more. What should providers be thinking about? What are the red flags? Should they be screening? If a woman expresses that she's had these experiences, what should they be doing? And what should they not be doing? What is the minimum of do no harm and compassionate care? So that's another piece where I feel as though we could definitely contribute. A next piece is around prevention. And when we talk about sort of holistic care for violence against women, we definitely recognize that access to justice and good laws is really crucial, and that tends to be in most countries where we start. But we know that's not enough. We also know that compassionate services are important, and if we really want to reduce it overall, we need to do prevention. And that's another area where I would say that probably public health practitioners have more experience than possibly lawyers. Trying to make any generalizations here, but it is something we do all the time. We think about prevention more than just treating the problem itself or just curing it. We do campaigns all the time for behavior change, for how to increase vaccinations or breastfeeding or other kinds of social problems or behavior, lifestyle problems. So I feel like that's an area where we could be thinking in a partnership of how do we think about these problems in a more holistic way. And then finally, the last thought, and I just want to say, one thing we're not always that good about in social problems is thinking about the roots of the problem. And particularly in the United States, we tend to just think about, okay, this is bad, you have to stop doing it. And that doesn't actually work. You know, smoking is bad for you, don't smoke, any of these issues. And we know from the South, that's where we can learn from the Global South, because they have been doing a lot of work on social norms. How does patriarchy feed into all of this? How do we start thinking about our own cultures, our rape culture? The idea that came out so clearly was so, you know, astonishing that after Me Too, we could, just a few months later, be listening to our leaders say, well, you know, she was probably, it might have been her fault, or, you know, that's not really that big a deal, and all the things that we went through with the Supreme Court hearings that I think many of us in the room just had us hysterical for weeks. I was hysterical, certainly. So learning more about that. And then the final piece again is effectiveness. That's another thing that we do. We don't deal with individual solutions. We look at, did these policies, did this campaign, or did these efforts for social change, overall, have they made a difference? And both, you know, in terms of our experience in policy analysis, but also in our experience in evaluation research, and looking at both specific interventions and sort of the whole gamut of policy. So those are my thoughts, and I just want to hope that we can take this as a starting point for thinking more about partnerships. And thank you again for such an inspiring talk.
Pass that over to,
Should I?
oh, you want to
start?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm worried, I don't have my notebook with me, or, because you had so many important points.
Do you want my pen? I
No,
always.
I can
Too late.
jump and get it. There's just a few things that struck me as you were talking that I didn't want to forget. That the first is, I don't think it's an answer to your question really, but it is an important point about the ways in which we silo ourselves as movements, but the law itself is siloed too. And so one of the reasons that I think that you have seen one set of conversations about domestic violence that are happening very differently from other conversations around the way that violence is impacting institutions where people can be liable is our laws treat them very differently. And so part of the conversation that's happening among a group of activists is, well, what do you need to do to make sure that institutional response to domestic violence is incorporated into various agendas that are being built more broadly. But I will say that there is the conversation that's happening with Me Too, and then the various work that different people are doing. And many of the people, like Tarana Burke herself, are really thinking about violence no matter where it sits, and are thinking, and that is how they are building their line of work. And so I think there's a perception that the work is totally siloed and limited, but not with everyone. The second thing is that I really do believe the point about how do you have more information both around prevalence, around solutions that actually are effective, around, and not just campaigns, but actually solutions that people are implementing in real time, some maybe too rapidly. And there's a giant research gap. And, you know, we need people to take that agenda up and provide the support, because I don't know how often you have so many institutions willing to listen and be a part of this. You know, those windows and moments come along every so often, and we are still in one. And some of it, I think, some of the learning that we have had from that are indicating sort of risk factors even needs to be tested. The EEOC put out a really great report that identified various types of risk factors in employment that makes it more likely that no matter what sector you are in, you are going to have a problem of harassment. Now, there are some sectors that hold on to, embrace, and grow those risk factors, so they are gonna be worse. But, you know, whether it is the giant power imbalances that you see, especially in workplaces where wages are paid low and structures are not good for workers, or workplaces where you have a really powerful individual that is perceived as untouchable, that no one will try to disrupt their conduct in the way that pervades. And you've seen a lot of those stories in the media, very few stories about workplaces that just operate with power and structural imbalances. And then the last point that I wanted to say before I forget it is around social change and norms. And I think we can feel the change that's happening. I don't know where it starts and will stop. And my deep worry, frankly, is that if we don't begin to put some things around it to make our laws and policies catch the cultural change, that we may swing in directions that are actually harmful, right? Or that the solutions that are lifted up as the solution at some point are not just the wrong ones, are solutions that take us back in a direction. So I think global learning, which a lot of domestic advocates like us, we don't spend a lot of time doing that, but global learning in this moment is even more important because this is actually a global conversation too. That's one of the benefits and joys of being so digitally connected. So thank you for all of your things, and I'm ready to work.
Hopefully too many microphones up here will start making noise with each other. I just really wanted to say thank you for bringing up the information about healthcare. In Ohio, I was a part of the sexual assault response team as a hospital advocate, and the disparate care you would see with how providers were working with survivors in terms of respecting people's pronouns or willingness to provide certain portions of the exam due to how someone identified that, well, you don't have the right to do that, or we can't serve you, or just hearing hospital staff talk about people who are coming in, or don't worry, this is the 4th time this person has been in here. It's never the truth, it's not what's happening. And just the kind of the disregard that you would see from some people of just an attitude that was so pervasive, because people get burnt out pretty easily. And so I think it is an area that's overlooked quite a bit. And that's actually a big part of what brought me here in terms of that equal access. And my biggest interest is in the reporting process. The reporting process shouldn't be worse than the assault or the harassment that you've already gone through, and they don't call it the second rate for nothing. It can be such a re-traumatizing experience for people, whether it to whatever level of violence that you've experienced. And you see how publicized things are now, that even if you come forward with anything that might have happened to you, that it can become such a large issue that your thought process shouldn't be, how is this going to come down on me? How is my life, not what might I lose, but what will I lose if I come forward and say this? Is my career going to be over? Am I never going to be able to work in that industry again? Am I never going to be able to look these people in the eye? Am I going to lose my partner because they're not going to believe me, or they're not going to trust me? And there is so much of that messaging, I think, that we see in that fear that harassment can really lead to. It's toxic stress. It really is. And toxic stress, I think, gets talked about a lot in terms of young children, but it can be experienced at any time. And when you're living in that height, we spend more time with our coworkers than we do with our families, and than we do with basically anyone else in our lives. And when you're in that perpetual state of heightened arousal, it changes your body's chemistry. It changes how you react to situations. It changes how you interact with other people, how you trust, how you function. And it really then changes how you respond to stress for the rest of your life. 5 years later, 6 years later, why do I have 6 colds every year? Why am I developing chronic disease? Why are these things happening? It's because of stress's impact of your body not being able to handle starting to shut down. And it's just something that I don't think gets talked about enough and thought about enough. And so it's very encouraging and discouraging at the same time. I'm so glad that there's so much more of a conversation happening about it right now. And that makes me very, very happy. One of the things that I kind of wanted to bring forward and ask is, like you were saying, that swinging of the pendulum. I'm also actively observing a disengagement and a desensitization of, well, they're only coming forward because it's trendy now. And, oh, too many people have come forward, or why didn't that person come forward when it first happened, and kind of that, at what point are people, until we can put something in place, how do we prevent everything from just being swept under the rug again? And unfortunately, I agree that Title IX changes, I think, are going to contribute. It's going to shift a college culture and a K-12 culture back in a direction that we were making progress in. But I'm just curious about what you think in terms of all the heightened publicity, not only its effect on survivors, but also other people's perception of how much they're now seeing, that if people weren't coming forward at that rate before, that kind of desensitization to the severity or the truthfulness of the stories being brought forward.
And so thank you for raising so many of those questions. I mean, the question around whether or not there has been so much attention that people are shutting it out or believing that it's normalized, so therefore no solution. I mean, I'm not sure that we know the answer to that question yet. Initially, the media attention, I think, was prompting to narrow a view of what actually sexual violence looked like. And as a result, if it wasn't the stories people read about Weinstein and the others, it didn't count. And so what we were hearing from people is that, their experience was considered not serious enough to warrant the sort of attention it actually deserved, because it's like, well, at least it wasn't that. And part of the solution to that was telling even more stories and having a diversity and range of stories of survivors and a diversity and range of stories of what abuse looks like. And there is a harm to that, right? I think, again, from this fall, people held onto, in really serious ways, a real harm from having to relive experiences that many people had not wanted to relive. They thought that they had effectively put them in the shadows. And so what it means to be in this period where it is survivors on the front line that are driving it is that approach probably isn't sustainable. You guys can tell me whether you think from a health perspective whether it is, but it feels not sustainable. And I do think institutions are left with the feeling that things have to be different. And so the question that I think remains for us is, how do we continue to push for that without having to always center the trauma of individuals and have us have this sort of collective trauma that we're holding as it really to get anything done. The other thing that I think you named a little bit in there that I just want to raise is how hard it is for, you named that the stress and that people are burnt out. And so part of their response that is probably not necessarily trauma informed and certainly not necessarily the best way to greet someone who's had that experience is driven by their own experiences that they're bringing. And that's true in lots of settings, that many of the first line people are carrying their own weight. And again, how we develop responses there so that people are equipped and supported. People who have, with our intake, which is only a legal intake, we have been inundated this year. but those who are running crisis center lines and hotlines, who are providing a range of support, they have been overwhelmed. And with each story, there is a spike, each and every time, right? And so how you sustain that, because those people who are the frontline people are actual people and have their own needs that need to be met. So I'm really grateful to you for raising that.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, these are really important topics, and so we have a few minutes to take questions from the audience, but Dean Goldman, you have Gary.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. Thank you for your leadership and everything you're doing. So one thing that's slightly different, one thing that's really concerning me these days, and I'd be interested in any of the panelists' comments and your comments, is a tendency now on the right to try to justify what I see as discriminatory and harassment practices, whether that's with regard to women's access to reproductive health aspects, or whether that's to how people are treated in public on the grounds of exercising religious freedom. And so the Hobby Lobby case comes to mind particularly, and it was a concern. And so what do you see as the strategies to deal with that? I think it's going to be heavily legal strategies, but what are your thoughts about that, and particularly now in the context of the Supreme Court raises some significant challenges, I think.
Well, I will start, but I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. You know, there's no question that that is one of the things that we're very much in the middle of grappling with. And someone who's coming from this administration, who has seized the Hobby Lobby decision and then said, let's leap forward further, right? So it's not even just religion, it's just any individual's moral views, or whatever they are naming as their moral views, should all of a sudden trump other protections, right? And so it is absolutely a threat that the idea that we have this cultural narrative that is out there that we're confronting, that you know, my right and anyone's right to be free of experiencing discrimination, no matter where I'm sitting, no matter where I live, no matter where I work or go to school, should be somehow less important than what you have named as your moral value. And so one of the things that we're doing is legal strategy. So we have filed suit against the Trump administration's rule that basically said that people could use their religious or moral views to deny access to contraception. There are real and meaningful consequences for that. But some of it is also a cultural conversation, and I think telling stories of the people who are actually harmed by that sort of discrimination is important. We've done some of that storytelling through our clients, but there are other ways to sort of help people understand that the narrative that they put out actually has really important harmful effects for individuals who may lose that job, individuals who may have to pay a tremendous amount of money that they didn't have. You know, one of our clients who's saving for a home suddenly has a $1,200 bill that she has to pay because her insurance company decides that its religious view is more important than hers. You know, I actually think the storytelling component ultimately is as important as the legal strategies, especially in this area.
Yeah, so I also have a question. So one of the things that I began to realize, and I live in the community that Brett Kavanaugh grew up in, and the culture in that community has not changed a lot since that time. The things that were described very much resonated with me. Now it's sexy, maybe you have it been, okay, there are changes. But one of the things that I've walked away from that feeling is that in many ways, somehow we are all complicit with this socially. And what I mean is that the differential expectations on male and female behaviors, how those are viewed, how, at least I felt as the mother or the daughter, that there was a little bit of an assumption that she's at risk. She's at risk. But the boys who are involved are not. They're not. That their behavior is okay. It's within an envelope of permissible behavior. Anything that happens to her fault, me as a parent calling my fault as well, you know. And, you know, how do we go deeper? And it gets back to Mary's question about just the overall culture, not of just faith, but really of whether it's patriarchy or differential treatment of girls, acceptance of violence, acceptance of discrimination. How, as far as we've come, you know.
That was a tough period for sure for some of that reason. I mean, some of what we saw was elites covering for elites, and I think it was important to name that was exactly what was happening. But some of it, I think it was, as you say, preserving a culture. And we are in this cultural tension right now, I think. Some efforts to sort of preserve it, and that's why you have the dog whistling, and the 7-minute dog whistling that you had from President Trump and others at the time. It's sort of like, he could be you next, and sort of, you know, would be, don't worry,
Your son.
Don't worry. This was a protecting the culture, protecting misogyny, protecting that, and you sort of saw that if you were, I was in the hearing rooms, you sort of saw that with some of the senators who, it's clear that they saw themselves in the younger, like that could have been me. At the same time, you didn't have a situation where there was an honest conversation about cultural change. It was such a missed opportunity. It could have been a conversation about, this is some of the things that happen when kids were young in this area. This is some of the things that actually might still happen. Here's what we deserve going forward. Instead, there was this strange agreement that people would say, of course that can never happen. And then they even leaped in and grabbed a bunch of race tropes by saying, well, they're acting like he was in a gang. Well, that's a cue that you're acting like he's black. I mean, that and we here at the National Women's Law Center a lot from people who contact us to talk about the experiences that they have had in college, but sometimes in high school, situations where they thought that they were going to have sex with one person, and then there's 3, 4 people. So the idea that this is a thing that never ever happens just is not true. It just is not true. And the idea that there are people who are suddenly so intoxicated they're not sure what happened, that's actually a very common fact pattern in the intake that we get. And so we could have had a conversation about what is actually happening right now and who do we want to be. That's not the one. We denied that it happened, so that was harmful. But if you know me, I always end on an inspiring note. What left me really hopeful was 2 different campaigns led by high school students. One was a campaign led by 15-year-old girls where they started a petition about what they expect. And they said, this isn't what we want for our lives. The other was 15-year-old and 17-year-old boys who said, this isn't the life we want either. And that left me hopeful. They don't have to own what we have unfortunately built for them.
Any other questions from our students? Okay. Marcia?
You know, I hate to rain on the lovely energy that you but, you know, since I work in women's health and have these discussions all the time, something that really disturbed me was the response of women in public health. Seeing their sons and their husbands as potentially having their careers stymied if the reality of the light was shined on their histories. And even basically soothing themselves with what I call cultural denial. And so how do we start? I think the conversation is critical because we know law is essential, but the whole culture around how we behave is very, very different. And so what we accept for ourselves is so essential in these discussions that we need to challenge. That's what bothered me when I heard the trial and we had a senator have a tantrum. Where was our tantrum, right? We didn't have, he was the last word. Well, there was no counter to that last word. So whenever I hear these things, including from public health people, we have a responsibility, if we know better, to say, you know better, right? This may be comfortable for you to say this, but it's not true. And I just want to make one last comment, because many of you are childbearing potential, and I always want to say that it always starts with us. We're responsible for ourselves, and the #1 cause of death for pregnant women, domestic violence, partner violence. So as you think about your relationships, you have to mirror the kind of behavior you accept and help your friends understand with clarity that they deserve a high-quality life that's free from violence.
I guess I'll just say that, yes, it's very inspiring to see young people taking this up. It was also pretty awesome to be on the steps of the Supreme Court on the day of the hearing with thousands and thousands of women, and I'm sure others were there too, but I felt that day like there is no other place I can be. I have got to go down there. And it was tens of thousands of women, hundreds and hundreds risking arrest to get into the gallery, to say, you know, I don't consent. And then at this very last moment where like the Supreme Court police were up there, like they were gonna arrest us if we didn't get off the steps. And suddenly there was this flood of women all the way up to the door saying, this is our house, and banging on the doors while he was being confirmed. That was pretty awesome, and I think that a lot of those women had never risked arrest before, they'd never been out before, and you know, I think that's the other piece of it that's inspiring.
Thank you. I'm Linda Blount with Black Women's Health and Area. And Fatima, I'm going to ask you to prognosticate a little bit. In another 13, 15 years or so, I want to build actually on the Dean's point. The average first-time voter won't be white. So as we look at this, at intersectionalities, we look at what's happening now and look at where we're going demographically in this country and understanding the current power structures and the fact that, and kind of really, Marcia, to your point, that people do what they value. Where do you see this going? Because I like the fact that you want to end up on an optimistic note. I'd like to be right there with you. But this country is changing. And so what are your thoughts about where we might be 25 years from now on this issue?
Well, I don't think it's gonna happen organically, what I will say. I think it's gonna take us fighting for what we want. But I do think that tension of the racial demographic shift, the cultural shifts, the power shift as more and more spaces become less homogenous, each of those moves come with significant resistance. Those things just don't happen on their own. And the way that I have, after some time and reflection and tears, really come to understand what we witnessed in this last fall as a really ultimate resistance in the middle of a really forceful change. And after that, people could have shut down and said, I'm done, but I don't think that that's going to happen. I think we had more people who understood for the first time that the cultural conversation that they may have been dodging was affecting them. So it is my hope that in a generation, the young people, the reason I was really, I mean, I was out there with the folks who I've never seen engage in Supreme Court activism like that in my life. So that was amazing to see. The reason that it is the younger people who really left me inspired is because they name with such clarity the vision and world that I want to see. And if they are teenagers who are able to name that and be supported in naming that, then we have some hope that when they are driving things in 15 years that things can be different. The challenge that we have is you have young people who are naming that with adults who are saying they're wrong, right? And so how do we find and continue to find those bright lights and support that? When I saw the young girls sort of saying, we're here with you and here's why and this is the world we want, I thought we need to be following their leadership. And how is it that 15-year-old girl is getting it in terms that are so much stronger than a singer? So it's sort of hard because oftentimes we're making this sort of incremental change, and so it's definitely hard to see. I think what's been interesting this last year is that you could see the cultural shifts. You could see them happening. You could see things that people said yesterday were no longer okay, and maybe tomorrow if they say them or do them, that they're going to be called on that, right? So you don't usually see that quickly. The challenge is we haven't actually changed our institutions to protect that. And so even if there is generational cultural change, I just don't know. But I think it doesn't happen organically. It's the world that I'm trying to fight for. And I'm doing that knowing there's going to be massive resistance precisely because there's going to be racial shifts that make people uncomfortable, that mean loss of power. There's going to be power shifts across gender. All of those things are going to mean that our work in this period will be highly resisted. And I have a friend who has studied this more deeply in the global South about what happens with multiracial democracies as there's a shift in demographics, and can you sustain yourself? He is even more of an optimist than I am and believes it hasn't really happened yet, but it will. And I believe that too, but it will be our greatest